The Great Hall of the Galactic Council had stood for 11,000 years. Its walls were made from a black stone that came from a dead star, and its ceiling reached so high that clouds sometimes formed near the top. Every seat in that hall had been filled by a different alien species at some point in history. Creatures with 6 arms, beings made of pure light, animals that breathed methane and floated like jellyfish in low gravity. All of them had sat in those curved rows of seats and spoken the careful, polished language of galactic diplomacy. Everything in that hall was old and serious and heavy with meaning. So when a human walked through the main doors for the very first time, nobody quite knew what to do. His name was Delegate Marcus Hale. He was not tall by human standards, but he was broad in the shoulders, and he walked with the kind of easy, relaxed confidence that made the other species deeply uncomfortable. He wore a dark suit instead of the shimmering diplomatic robes that every other delegate wore. He carried a small metal bottle, what he called a thermos, which was filled with hot coffee. He looked around the enormous hall the way a man might look around a train station he was passing through, not a place he was supposed to be impressed by. The Veth, who looked like tall silver cranes with 4 sets of eyelids, turned their long necks to watch him. The Dorothy, round and covered in soft gray fur, whispered to each other in their clicking language. The quorum of the Pale, 7 beings joined by a shared nervous system, went very still, all 7 heads turning toward the human at the same moment. The Grand Speaker, a Veth elder named Counselor Sethoran, spoke first. His voice came through the translation system as a smooth, perfectly modulated sound. Delegate Hale, you are the first representative of your species to enter this chamber. We welcome you, though we note you are several cycles early. Marcus pulled out a chair that had been assigned to him, a custom-built chair, since no standard council seat fit a human body, and sat down. He took a sip of his coffee. Yeah, he said, I got here early because I wanted to look around. Several translators struggled briefly with the word, yeah. It was not a word that translated cleanly into High Galactic. The system eventually settled on something like affirmative in formal register. Counselor Sethoran blinked 3 of his 4 sets of eyelids, a Veth expression of mild confusion. The session will not begin for another 30 cycles. There is nothing to observe at this time. There's always something to observe, Marcus said. He smiled. It was a small, relaxed smile, and it made several nearby delegates deeply uncomfortable without knowing exactly why. The story of how humanity had come to the Galactic Council was not a simple one. 30 years ago, Earth had received its first confirmed signal from an alien civilization, a narrowband transmission that came from a star system 40 light-years away. Within 6 months, humanity had decoded it. Within 2 years, they had sent a reply. Within a decade, they had been formally contacted by 3 separate alien species who had been watching Earth's radio signals for centuries, waiting to see if the noisy little planet would ever calm down enough to talk to. The answer, as far as the aliens were concerned, was not really. Humans were still argumentative, still chaotic, still prone to doing things that made no logical sense. But they were also fast. Faster than anything the Council had seen in a long time. They had gone from first contact to faster-than-light travel in 22 years, a development that had shocked the astrophysics community of every species in the galaxy. The previous record had been held by the Dorothy, who had taken over 400 years to achieve the same thing. The Council had debated what to do with humanity for the better part of a decade. Some wanted to isolate them. Others wanted to study them. The Quorum of the Pale had suggested, in their careful and unsettling way, that perhaps the humans should simply be observed from a safe distance until they destroyed themselves, as most young civilizations eventually did. What nobody had seriously suggested was giving them a seat at the table. That idea had come from an unlikely source, a Veth diplomat named Counselor Reith Soul, who had spent 7 years on Earth as part of a cultural exchange program. She had come back changed. She could not fully explain what had happened to her during those 7 years, but she had stood up in the council chamber and made a 40-minute argument for human inclusion that had left half the chamber in stunned silence and the other half arguing furiously. Her argument had come down to 3 main points. First, that humans were going to be in space whether the council invited them or not. Second, that they were better to have inside the tent than outside it. And third, the point that had caused the most debate, that humanity had something the rest of the galaxy had been quietly lacking for a very long time. She had called it unreasonable determination. The motion had passed by a narrow margin. And so Marcus Hale, former military engineer, former deep space construction worker, former advisor to the United Earth Diplomatic Corps, had been chosen as humanity's first delegate to the Galactic Council. He had not been the first choice. The first choice had been a career diplomat named Dr. Elaine Voss, who was brilliant and polished and spoke 4 languages. She had declined, saying privately that she thought the first human in the council chamber should be someone who would not be intimidated by 11,000 years of history. She had recommended Marcus herself. Now Marcus sat in his custom chair, drinking his coffee, and watching the chamber fill up around him. The agenda for the day's session had been distributed 3 cycles earlier, and it was a long one. Trade disputes between the Veth and the Karate colonies. The ongoing problem of dark matter harvesting rights in the Spiral Arm territories. A proposal from the Quorum of the Pale about restructuring the Council's emergency response protocols. And, at the very end of the agenda, a brief introductory address from humanity's new delegate. The full chamber session would begin in 30 cycles. Marcus had those 30 cycles to himself. He used them the way he always used spare time, by thinking. He walked slowly around the outer ring of the chamber, looking at the plaques on the walls. Each plaque marked a decision the council had made, going back thousands of years. Some of the decisions were written in languages that no living being could fully read anymore. He stopped at one that had been translated into High Galactic and read it twice. It was a declaration from 9,000 years ago, signed by 23 species, agreeing that no civilization had the right to destroy another, regardless of the reason. It was called the Declaration of Continuance, and it was considered the foundation of everything the council stood for. Marcus stared at it for a long time. Then he took another sip of coffee and went back to his seat. When the session began, Councillor Sethorin called the chamber to order with a single strike of a resonance rod that sent a deep, humming tone through the floor. Every delegate went silent immediately. Every delegate except Marcus, who was finishing a thought he had been writing in a small paper notebook. Several nearby delegates stared at the notebook. Paper was rare. Most species had stopped using it thousands of years ago. Marcus noticed them staring. He didn't explain. He just capped his pen and looked up at the front of the chamber, where Councillor Sethorin was beginning his opening remarks. The session moved through its agenda slowly, as council sessions always did. Marcus listened carefully. He did not speak. He took notes. He watched how the different species interacted, who deferred to whom, who pushed back, who stayed silent. He learned more in those first 3 hours than he had in 3 months of diplomatic briefings back on Earth. And then, near the end of the session, Councillor Sethorin looked in Marcus's direction and said, "We now turn to the matter of humanity's formal introduction. Delegate Hale, you may address the council." Marcus stood up. The chamber was very quiet. He looked around at the hundreds of faces, the long silver necks of the Veth, the soft round heads of the Dorothy, the 7 simultaneous gazes of the Quorum of the Pale, and he thought about the Declaration of Continuance on the wall, and about everything Councillor Reithsol had said 7 years ago, and about why Elaine Voss had turned down this job and given it to him instead. He thought about what the right thing to say was, and then he said it. 3 words. The chamber went completely silent. Not the polite silence of a diplomatic pause, but the deep, stunned silence of a room full of beings who had not expected what they had just heard. Translation systems flickered. Several delegates looked at each other. The Quorum of the Pale, all 7 of them, leaned forward at the same moment. Councillor Sethorin stared at him with all 4 sets of eyelids fully open, which was a Veth expression that had no easy translation, but meant something very close to absolute shock. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Marcus sat back down and picked up his coffee. The 3 words Marcus Hale had spoken were, "We need changes." That was all. No elaborate greeting. No prepared speech. No careful diplomatic language designed to say something without actually saying anything. Just 3 plain words in a chamber that had existed for 11,000 years and had never once heard anything spoken quite so directly. The silence lasted longer than any silence in recent council memory. Later, political analysts from 6 different species would write about that moment, and most of them would disagree about exactly what made it so shocking. Some said it was the informality. Others said it was the confidence. The Dorothy scholar Muhate would eventually write a paper arguing that what had stunned the chamber was not the words themselves but the tone, the complete absence of apology in them. The way Marcus had spoken as though he had every right to say exactly what he meant. He did, of course. That was the thing. As a recognized delegate, he had every right to speak plainly. The rules of the council required only that a delegate address the chamber with respect. They said nothing about requiring diplomatic vagueness. But no one had tested that in a very long time. Counselor Seth Oren recovered first. He was, after all, one of the oldest and most experienced diplomats in the galaxy. And if there was one thing his 1100 years of service had taught him, it was that the most important moments were the ones where you stayed calm when everyone else did not. He brought the resonance rod down again, gently, and said, "Delegate Hale, would you care to elaborate?" Marcus stood up again. He set his coffee down on the little ledge built into his station. He looked around the chamber once, slowly, and then he began to speak. What he said over the next 40 minutes was not what anyone expected. He did not complain about human exclusion or demand special treatment for his species. He did not threaten anything or make any wild promises. Instead, he talked about the data. He had spent 6 months reviewing every major council decision of the last 500 years. He had studied the patterns. He had looked at the outcomes. And what he had found, stated simply, without any attempt to soften it, was that the council had a problem. A serious one. Not a problem of bad intentions, but a problem of structure. The council's decision-making process, he explained, had been built for a galaxy of stable, slow-moving civilizations. It required consensus. It required lengthy deliberation. It had multiple veto mechanisms designed to ensure that no single species could dominate the others. In the context of 11,000 years ago, when the founding species had been around for millions of years, and the greatest threat was interstellar war between ancient powers, this made sense. But the galaxy was different now. New species were emerging. Technology was moving faster. The threats that mattered, resource collapse in the outer territories, the slow decay of communication relay networks, the growing unrest in the independent colony systems, were not the kind of threats that waited politely for a council consensus to form. They were fast problems. And the council, built for slow answers, kept arriving too late. He had numbers. He had case studies. He had 3 specific examples from the last 2 decades where the council's delay had directly worsened a crisis that might have been manageable if addressed 6 months earlier. The chamber listened. Some delegates listened with hostility. Some listened with curiosity. The quorum of the Pale listened with their 7 heads perfectly still, which was the closest they came to giving anything their full attention. When Marcus finished, Counselor Seth Oren looked at him for a long moment and said, "You have been a member of this body for less than 1 day, Delegate Hale." "I know," Marcus said. "And you are suggesting that we restructure processes that have existed for thousands of years." "I'm not suggesting anything yet," Marcus said. "I'm telling you what I found. What you do with it is your business. You asked me to elaborate, and I elaborated." Another silence. This one was shorter, and it had a different quality, less stunned, more thoughtful. It was Counselor Yentheri of the Dorothy who spoke next. She was small, even by Dorothy's standards, with wide amber eyes and the careful, precise manner of a scientist. She had been on the council for 40 years, which was most of her adult life. "Your data on the outer relay crisis," she said. "Your timeline suggests the council received warnings 14 months before the network began failing." "Correct," Marcus said. "And your argument is that had emergency protocols allowed for a faster initial response, the collapse would have been partial, not total. 43 relay stations could have been reinforced in time. The communication blackout in the spiral arm would have lasted weeks instead of 3 years." He paused. "I can share the full analysis if the council wants it." Yentheri looked at Counselor Seth Oren. Something passed between them, a look that had the weight of a long professional relationship and a complicated history. "We will review your analysis," Seth Oren said carefully. "In the appropriate committee." "Of course," Marcus said. He sat down. He picked up his coffee. The session ended an hour later. As the delegates filed out of the chamber, Marcus stayed in his seat, making notes. He was aware of being watched. He had been aware of it all day. But the watching felt different now, less like curiosity about an exotic new species and more like the careful, evaluating attention of people who were trying to decide what to do about something unexpected. He finished his notes and walked out of the chamber into the long corridor that led to the delegates' residential wing. The council complex was enormous, a self-contained city, really, spread across the surface of a small moon that had been terraformed specifically for the purpose. The residential wing alone had 14 different atmospheric zones to accommodate the breathing needs of various species. Marcus's zone was near the center, where oxygen levels and temperature were kept at Earth normal. He was halfway to his quarters when he heard footsteps behind him. Light, quick ones, a Veth gait, which was distinctive because of the double-jointed leg structure. He turned around. It was not Sethoran. It was a younger Veth, perhaps 200 or 300 years old, which in Veth terms was still quite junior. She had the silver-white coloring of the coastal Veth, different from Sethoran's deeper gray. "Delegate Hale," she said. Her high Galactic was very precise. "I am Delegate Reeflian. My mother sends her regards." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Reef Soul?" "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Reef Soul, the Veth diplomat who had spent 7 years on Earth and then argued successfully for human inclusion. "Your mother never came back to Earth," he said, after she made her argument. "I always wondered about that." "She was not sure she would be welcome," Reeflian said. The vote was very close. There were delegates who felt she had overstepped. "She did the right thing," Marcus said. Reeflian tilted her head, a Veth gesture that the translation system logged as acknowledgement, but that Marcus read, from his briefings, as something closer to gratitude. "She said you would say that," she told him. "She also said to tell you something." "What?" She said, "Do not be too fast. The council is old, and old things break if you push them too quickly. But do not be too slow either." She said you would understand what she meant. Marcus thought about it. "I think I do," he said. Reeflian nodded, a gesture she had clearly adopted from Earth, since Veth did not normally nod, and turned to leave. Then she stopped. "What you said today," she said, without turning around. The 3 words. "My mother predicted you would say something like that." She said humans always do. Always say what they mean. Always arrive ready, Reeflian said. And then she walked away. Marcus watched her go. Then he turned and continued down the corridor toward his quarters. He had a meeting in 2 days with Counselor Yentheri to discuss his analysis in detail. He had a separate meeting with the head of the Council's Emergency Protocols Committee, a karate elder named Delegate Vorith, who had been on the committee for 60 years and was known for being both brilliant and completely immovable. He had a long list of things he needed to read before those meetings. He also had a message waiting for him from Earth. He knew what it would say before he opened it. His supervisor at the United Earth Diplomatic Corps, checking in on his first day, wanting to know how it went, wanting to know if he had made any mistakes. He sat down at the small desk in his quarters and opened the message. His supervisor's face appeared on the screen. She was a small woman in her 60s, sharp-eyed and careful. Her name was Director Amara Singh, and she had spent 40 years in diplomacy and had survived 3 different international crises by being the calmest person in any given room. "Marcus," she said, "how was the first day?" He thought about the stunned silence. About all 4 sets of Sethoran's eyelids opening wide. About Reeflian in the corridor. About the declaration of continuance on the wall. "Interesting," he said. Director Singh looked at him for a moment. "I'm hearing from our contact in the Veth Diplomatic Corps that you caused something of a stir." I said what needed to be said. "Marcus." She paused. "You've been there 1 day." "I know. The council has been running for 11,000 years." "I know that too," he said. "But Director, when's the last time anyone in that chamber said something that actually surprised them?" She was quiet. "That's what I thought," Marcus said. "Get some rest. I'll report in tomorrow." He closed the message and looked out the small window of his quarters. The moon's surface was pale and flat, and above it hung the enormous blue-white shape of the gas giant it orbited. 3 council ships were visible in orbit, their running lights blinking slowly in the dark. He opened his notebook and wrote 2 words at the top of a fresh page. Day 2. Then he started planning. Delegate Vorith of the karate did not believe in short meetings. He believed in thorough ones. He had held his position on the Emergency Protocols Committee for 62 years, and in that time, he had sat through meetings that lasted multiple days. Meetings conducted entirely in writing because the species involved could not agree on a shared verbal language, and one meeting that had been interrupted by an actual emergency and still somehow continued on a secondary channel while the emergency was being handled. He was not a man who hurried. Marcus arrived at Vorth's office 6 minutes early and sat in the waiting area, which was kept at a slightly lower temperature than Earth normal and smelled faintly of something mineral and sharp. A karate comfort scent, he had been told. He used the 6 minutes to review his notes. When Vorth's door opened, the karate elder filled most of the doorway. The karate were large beings, bipedal, but built much more massively than humans, with broad flat heads and skin that shifted color slightly, depending on their mood. Vorth's skin was currently a deep, steady bronze, which Marcus's briefings told him meant he was calm and focused. That was a good sign. "Delegate Hale," Vorth said. His voice through the translation system was deep and very measured. "Come in." The office was lined with physical records, not paper, but thin crystalline tablets stacked in careful rows on shelves that went from floor to ceiling. There were thousands of them. Marcus looked at them as he sat down across from Vorth's desk. "You keep physical copies," Marcus said. "Digital systems fail," Vorth said. "Crystals do not. Not in any time frame that matters." He settled into his chair with the slow, deliberate movement of someone who was very large and had learned to be careful about furniture. "You want to talk about the emergency protocols?" "I want to understand them first," Marcus said. "Then talk about them." Vorth looked at him. The bronze of his skin deepened slightly. "Most delegates who come to me with reform proposals have already decided what they want before they walk through the door." "I know," Marcus said. "That's not how I work." What followed was not the confrontation Marcus had expected and Vorth had clearly prepared for. Instead, it became something closer to a seminar. Vorth walked him through the history of the emergency protocols, how they had been built, what crises had shaped them, what failures had been corrected over the centuries. He was thorough and precise, and Marcus listened to all of it without interrupting. 3 hours in, Vorth paused and looked at Marcus differently. "You are taking notes," he said. "I always take notes. On paper. It helps me think." Vorth was quiet for a moment. "My grandfather kept physical records," he said. "In the old style. Before everything became digital." He seemed to be deciding something. Then he reached under his desk and placed a crystalline tablet on the surface between them. "This is the original emergency response charter. The actual original, from the Council's 4th century. I am going to show you something that is not in any digital archive." Marcus leaned forward. The charter, when Vorth translated the relevant sections, contained a clause that had never been formally removed, but had also never been formally used. It was a provision for what the original founders had called acute crisis delegation, a mechanism by which the Council could, under specific defined conditions, grant temporary emergency decision-making authority to a small group of delegates without requiring full chamber consensus. "This has never been used," Vorth said, "in over 10,000 years. Why not? Because the conditions for invoking it were written so narrowly that no crisis has ever met all the criteria simultaneously." He set the tablet down. "The founders were afraid of giving too much power to too few. They made the trigger conditions almost impossible to achieve." Marcus looked at the tablet. "But the mechanism exists. It exists. And the conditions could theoretically be updated, if the Council voted to amend them. Theoretically." Vorth's skin shifted, just briefly, to a slightly lighter shade. "An amendment of that nature would require a supermajority. 3/4 of all seated delegates. How many is that?" "Currently, 219 votes." Marcus did the math in his head. "And how many votes are typically available on reform proposals? For structural reforms? In recent history?" Vorth folded his large hands on the desk. "Perhaps 60 to 80. Possibly 90, if the proposal is very carefully argued." "That's a big gap," Marcus said. "Yes. So whoever wants to fix the protocol problem needs about 130 votes they don't currently have. Approximately." Marcus wrote something in his notebook. Then he looked up. "Delegate Vorth. In 62 years on this committee, has anyone ever come close?" Vorth considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Once," he said. 40 years ago. A Veth proposal. It reached 104 votes before it collapsed." "What happened?" "The karate bloc withdrew support. There was a trade dispute at the time. The politics became complicated." He paused. "The delegate who led that proposal was Reith Sol." Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Tell me about the karate bloc." Vorith looked at him for a long time. The bronze of his skin was very steady. Why? Because if the karate block withdrew last time and killed the vote, then the karate block is the variable that needs to change this time. He said it simply, without any accusation in it. Just observation. I'm not assuming you'll support anything. I just want to understand where your people stand and why. Another long pause. Then Vorith said something that Marcus had not expected. The karate withdrew because we were not included in the design of the proposal. Wreathsoul built her coalition around the Veth and the Dorothy. She assumed karate support without asking for it. When the trade dispute gave us a reason to leave, we took it. Not because we disagreed with the proposal, but because we had not been asked. Marcus wrote in his notebook. That, he said, is extremely useful to know. He left Vorith's office 4 hours after he had entered it, with 12 pages of notes and a tentative agreement to meet again in 10 days. He walked back to his quarters slowly, thinking. The next 2 weeks moved quickly. Marcus had meetings with 12 different delegations, and he approached each one the same way, not pitching anything, not arguing, not presenting demands, just asking questions and listening, learning why each group had voted the way it had on past reforms, learning what each group needed to feel included rather than managed, learning, slowly, what the shape of a possible coalition might look like. He sent Director Singh a summary every 3 days. Her replies grew progressively shorter as the summaries grew longer, which he took as a sign that she was reading them carefully and did not want to interrupt his momentum. On the 15th day, he had a meeting with Counselor Yin Theory of the Dorothy. This one was different from the others. Yin Theory had reviewed his data analysis in full, and she had brought her own data, research from a Dorothy academic institution that had been studying council response times for 30 years. Her data and his data agreed. The problem was real, it was measurable, and it was getting worse. The question, Yin Theory said, is not whether change is needed. I think most serious people in this building know change is needed. The question is whether it is possible. I think it might be, Marcus said. She looked at him. Wreathsoul thought so too. 40 years ago. I know. But Wreathsoul didn't have the karate. And she built her proposal first, and then tried to find support for it. He shook his head. I'm doing it the other way around. Yin Theory was quiet for a long moment. You are building the coalition first, she said, and then designing the proposal to fit the coalition. The proposal needs to be something everyone helped make, Marcus said. Otherwise, someone always has a reason to walk away. She studied him. How long have you been doing this? Talking to people? About 2 weeks. No. I mean, how long have you been doing this kind of work? This kind of political work? Marcus thought about it. My whole life, in one way or another. I grew up in a neighborhood where if you wanted anything to change, you had to figure out who needed to agree and why. The scale is different here. The species are different. But the basic problem is the same. Yin Theory made a small sound that the translation system rendered as thoughtful acknowledgement. Then she said, what do you need from the Dorothy? Right now? Nothing specific. I just want to know if you're willing to be part of the design process. Not just the voting. She tilted her head. And if I am, then I'll come back when I have enough of the shape of a proposal to show you something real. And you'll tell me what's wrong with it. And we'll fix it before anyone else sees it. She was quiet again. Then she said, my mother served on the council 30 years before me. She used to say that the hardest thing about diplomacy was not finding the right answer. It was finding the answer that enough people could live with. Smart woman, Marcus said. She was. A pause. All right, Delegate Hale. Come back when you have something to show me. He walked back through the long corridors of the council complex that evening, and he felt, for the first time since he had arrived, that the enormous weight of the building around him was something he understood. Not a monument to be awed by. A machine. A very old, very complicated machine that had been running for 11,000 years and had developed some serious problems that nobody had been willing to say plainly. Until 3 words had been spoken in a chamber full of stunned faces. He stopped in the main corridor outside the Great Hall and looked at the closed doors. They were enormous, 15 meters tall, made from the same black Dead Star stone as the walls, engraved with the names of every founding species in the original language of the charter. He looked at those names for a long time. Then he took out his notebook and started writing. He had a proposal to build, and for the first time, he thought he might actually have enough people to build it with. The vote was scheduled for the 43rd day of Marcus Hale's tenure as humanities delegate to the Galactic Council. By galactic standards, 43 days was nothing, less than nothing. It was a rounding error on the timescale the Council operated by. Proposals of this scale, structural amendments to the core emergency protocols, changes to the fundamental operating rules of a body that had governed interstellar diplomacy for 11,000 years, typically spent years in committee before they were ever brought to a full chamber vote. Some proposals waited decades. The record for the longest deliberation before a vote was held by a territorial boundary amendment that had spent 240 years in committee before finally being voted down. 43 days was not how things were done. That was, Marcus had come to understand, precisely the point. He had spent the last 2 weeks in a series of meetings that had grown from individual conversations to small working groups to a drafting committee of 14 delegates representing 9 different species. He had run every meeting the same way, with a short agenda, a clear goal for the session, and a very firm commitment to finishing on time. The other delegates had found this baffling at first. Council committee meetings did not have set end times. They ended when they ended, which sometimes meant they lasted for days. "We will finish by the 6th hour," Marcus had said at the start of the first drafting meeting. Delegate Vorith had looked at him with calm bronze certainty. "That will not be possible." "Let's find out," Marcus had said. They had finished at the 5th hour and 40 minutes. Vorith had said nothing afterward, but his skin had shifted to a pale, lighter shade that Marcus had come to recognize as the karate equivalent of being mildly impressed. The proposal they had built together over 14 drafting sessions was not what Marcus had originally imagined when he had sat alone in his quarters writing in his notebook. It was better. It had been shaped and reshaped by 14 minds from 9 species, each of whom had caught something the others had missed, each of whom had brought a concern or a need that had made the final document stronger. The karate had insisted on specific language about consultation, rights before emergency authority could be invoked. The quorum of the Pale had proposed a sunset mechanism. Any emergency delegation of authority would automatically expire after 30 days unless renewed by the full chamber. Yin Theory of the Dorothy had restructured the trigger conditions so that they were specific and measurable rather than vague and judgment-dependent. What they had ended up with was an amendment that gave the Council a genuine emergency response capability, not unlimited, not unchecked, but real. A small emergency response panel of 7 delegates, drawn by rotation from the full chamber, with authority to make binding decisions on time-critical crises, subject to full chamber review within 45 days. Trigger conditions defined by measurable thresholds. Automatic sunset. Consultation requirements that protected smaller delegations from being steamrolled. And a provision, insisted on by Marcus and quietly supported by Vorith, that any emergency action taken by the panel could be reviewed and reversed by a 2/3 chamber vote at any time. It was not perfect. Nothing decided by committee ever was. But it was something. The vote count, as of the morning of day 43, stood at 211 pledged votes in favor. They needed 219. 8 votes short. Marcus stood in the corridor outside the Great Hall at the 6th hour of the morning, when the complex was still quiet and the atmospheric systems were cycling through their pre-session checks. He had not slept well. He had his thermos of coffee, his notebook, and a very specific problem. He knew who the 8 votes were. He had a list. 7 of them were from small delegations, species that had been in the council for a long time but rarely voted on structural matters, preferring to stay quiet and avoid the political costs of either side. One of them was a single delegate from a species called the Vrethkon, a solitary civilization from the outer edge of the galaxy that had been a council member for 3,000 years and had voted against every structural reform proposal in that entire time without exception. He had already talked to 6 of the 7 small delegations. 5 of them were genuinely undecided. One, the delegate from the Mirati Collective, had told him plainly that she would vote yes if the Vrethkon delegate did. She explained, not willing to be on the wrong side of the most ancient member of the council, which meant everything came back to the Vrethkon. Marcus had requested a meeting with Delegate Hanvarek of the Vrethkon 3 times in the past 2 weeks. Each time, the request had been acknowledged, but no meeting had been scheduled. The Vrethkon diplomatic office, which was a single room on the far eastern edge of the residential wing, had a reputation for being essentially impenetrable. Hanvarek had been the Vrethkon's representative to the council for over 900 years. He was the oldest serving delegate by a margin of several centuries. And he had never, in 900 years, voted for change. Marcus walked to the eastern wing. The door to the Vrethkon office was plain and unmarked. He knocked. After a long pause, the door opened. Hanvarek was small. That was the first thing. Marcus had not expected that. Every image he had seen of the Vrethkon delegate had been taken from a distance, and he had assumed someone of that age and reputation would be physically imposing. Instead, Hanvarek was perhaps 1.5 meters tall, with a slight, almost fragile build and skin the color of old paper. His eyes were very large and very dark, and they regarded Marcus with an expression that the translation system could not read at all. "Delegate Hale," he said. His high Galactic was archaic, older forms of phrasing that the translation system handled with a slight lag. "You have come to persuade me." "No," Marcus said. "I came to ask you something." A pause. "Come in." The office was nearly empty. A small table, 2 chairs, a single crystalline record tablet on a shelf. Nothing else. Marcus sat in one of the chairs. Hanvarek sat in the other. "In 900 years," Marcus said, "you have voted against every structural reform. I want to know why." Hanvarek looked at him for a very long time. "You are not asking me to change my vote. I'm asking you to explain it. I might disagree with your reasons, but I want to understand them first." Another long pause. Then Hanvarek said, "The council exists because species that would otherwise destroy each other have agreed to talk instead. That agreement is fragile. It has broken twice in 11,000 years. Both times, the breaking was preceded by a period of rapid structural change, reforms that moved faster than the trust between species could accommodate." He paused. "Speed is not always progress." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said. Hanvarek's large dark eyes focused on him. "You know, the relay crisis. The trade disputes in the spiral arm. Every crisis the current protocol failed to handle. All of them were slow-moving problems that became fast-moving emergencies because nobody acted early enough. Speed wasn't the enemy. Speed was what we needed and didn't have." He leaned forward slightly. "What's fragile isn't the council's speed. What's fragile is the council's credibility. And right now, credibility is being lost every time a crisis gets worse because the council was too slow to respond." Hanvarek was silent for a very long time, long enough that Marcus wondered if he had said something wrong. Then the old delegate said, "The previous reform, 40 years ago, the one proposed by Reithsol. Do you know why I voted against it?" "The trigger conditions were too broad," Marcus said. "It could have been invoked for situations that weren't true emergencies. It gave too much authority with too few checks." "Yes." A pause. "And yours?" "Specific measurable triggers. 7-delegate panel chosen by rotation so no block can control it. 30-day sunset. Full chamber review rights at any time. 2/3 vote can reverse any decision, any day." He paused. Vorith helped write the review mechanism. The quorum of the Pale wrote the sunset clause. Hanvarek looked at him. "You gave the karate and the quorum authorship of the restraint mechanisms. Because those are the mechanisms that matter most to them. And because they're right to care about them." The old delegate stood up slowly. He walked to the single shelf and picked up the crystalline tablet. He held it for a moment without looking at it. "My civilization has been in this council for 3,000 years, he said. "We have watched it survive things that should have destroyed it. We have watched it fail things it should have handled." He set the tablet down. "We do not change quickly, but we change when change is necessary." He turned and looked at Marcus. "I will read the full proposal before the vote." "That's all I'm asking," Marcus said. He left the office and walked back toward the main wing. His hands were steady. His mind was not. The session opened at the second hour of the afternoon. The chamber was fuller than Marcus had ever seen it. Delegates who rarely attended had come in person rather than sending representatives. The air in the hall had a particular quality to it, a kind of charged stillness, like the moment before something very large and very heavy begins to move. Councillor Sethorin called the session to order and introduced the amendment. He read the full title, the sponsors, and then asked if any delegate wished to speak before the vote. Several did. 3 spoke in favor. 2 spoke against, carefully, respectfully, citing concerns about precedent. Marcus listened to all of them. When the last speaker finished, Sethorin asked if there were any final statements. Marcus stood up. 11,000 years ago, he said, the founders of this council decided to build something that had never existed before. They didn't know if it would work. They built it anyway, because the alternative was worse. He looked around the chamber, at Vorith's steady bronze skin, at Yentheri's careful amber eyes, at Reeflian in the Veth delegation row. That's still the choice. The alternative to change is not stability. It's slow failure. This amendment doesn't make the council faster. It makes it capable. Those are different things. And every person in this room helped design it to be safe. He paused. That's all. He sat down. The vote was called. The count began. It took 20 minutes to collect all the votes from the full chamber. Marcus sat very still and did not count as the numbers were read because he had learned long ago that watching numbers climb was a way to lose your mind. Councillor Sethorin read the final tally. 222 votes in favor. 3 more than needed. Including, at the very end of the list, the single vote of Delegate Hanvorek of the Vrethkon. The chamber did not erupt. It was not that kind of place. But there was a sound, a collective exhale from hundreds of beings, a shift in the quality of the silence, that Marcus recognized as the sound of something historic settling into place. Sethorin looked at him across the chamber. All 4 sets of eyelids were open, not in shock this time, but in something that looked across the distance of 11,000 years in a translation system in a very different face, remarkably like respect. Marcus picked up his coffee. It was cold. He drank it anyway. That evening he wrote his report to Director Singh. It was the shortest report he had ever sent her. It passed, he wrote. 222. We have work to do. He closed the message and looked out the window at the gas giant hanging in the dark. 3 ships were visible in orbit, the same as always, their lights blinking in the old steady rhythm. He opened his notebook to a fresh page. Wrote the date at the top. Day 43. Below that, he wrote a single question that he had been carrying since his first morning in the chamber, since he had stood in front of hundreds of alien faces and said 3 words that no one had expected. The question was, what's next? He underlined it twice. And then he started writing the answer.